here we are, 10% plan. At least let everyone know what that plan was that Lincoln was thinking about for Reconstruction. And I know it didn't work for every place, and outcomes were
in essence, it has come to be seen when you think Lincoln and Reconstruction. This is his plan, his proclamation of amnesty and Reconstruction. Not to go into all of the specifics, but it's trying to he's trying to create a nucleus in the southern states that will eventually gain momentum, and it will undermine the Confederacy. Here's the deal. The 10% plan is not really a major departure, because Lincoln is thinking about Reconstruction from the very beginning. But what I think is really interesting about the 10% plan is that it incorporates, as far as he can go, it incorporates the abolition of slavery, now formally as a policy question, into the question of restoring seceded states to the Union. So now Lincoln, from a policy perspective, has officially said the conditions for restoration will be the abolition of slavery. And so he's crossed a major threshold there. It's not because he's now addressing Reconstruction for the first time, but it will now be about the abolition of slavery.
Jim in Janesville, Wisconsin, asks about the Lincoln-Alexander Stevens connection. Did he have any contact with him from the time after Congress and before his letter, his famous letter as president-elect? Is there any contact in between?
No, not that I'm aware of. They lost touch, and they quickly sort of rediscover each other when things start getting heated. And Lincoln looks to Stevens as perhaps someone who could vouch for him in the South, as someone who's not going to try to interfere with slavery where it exists, but someone who may actually be able to be a goodwill ambassador for him, someone who could speak out on his behalf.
No one, we don't know who wrote this one. Please put your name on when you send these in. Which aspects of actual Reconstruction began with Lincoln?
Oh my!
Briefly, just maybe a bullet point.
I'm stumped. This practical question. When you think about it from a policy question, how are the states going to be restored to the Union? And think about Lincoln's whole thinking with the wars. They haven't left. And it is an interesting conundrum, because if they haven't left, then do they still get all of the protections under the Constitution to which they are due? Well, obviously no. But if they have left, then that legitimizes the Confederacy, which is why Lincoln always said this is a practical problem. So who's going to be in charge? He's willing to be lenient if people will take an oath of allegiance to the United States. Then he's willing, in effect, to let bygones be bygones. But then he's got to start thinking again about the question of race and racial equality, and that makes everything more complicated.
Wayne in Ottawa, Ontario, asked this question of you, Chris. According to your book's information page, he says, Lincoln had played a role while congressman in international trade, stimulus spending, and banking. Could you comment on his role as a congressman in international trade?
Sure. Well, Lincoln had been very interested in the conduits of international trade, so roads, bridges, canals. As a member of the House, he doesn't get to vote on treaties, but he's very interested in trying to expand trade and expand markets for American producers. So we talked a little bit about that. We talked about the American system, where he's using government to build these build infrastructure and to sort of diversify the economy. His opponents had this nostalgic view that everyone was just going to live on a farm and do that for their living.
He wasn't having any of that.
No, no.
Wasn't Jeffersonian in that regard.
Yeah. No, not at all.
Here's a question from Ricardo in Harvest, Alabama, a member of the Tennessee Valley Civil War Roundtable. We appreciate your watching and participating as well. So here's another 2-hour question about how tenacious was Lincoln against slavery, and at what point in his life did he vehemently speak against slavery? Or vehemently speak against slavery? I'll put the emphasis there.
Well,
seemed always to me.
Lincoln is, we've talked about this, Illinois being a border state, his part of the world being the National Liberator, which was the main publication of the abolitionist movement in the country, actually called Illinois, for all intents and purposes, a slave state. So yeah, sure, we were free under the Northwest Ordinance, but black people might find themselves to be someone else's servant for life by signing an X on a contract that they couldn't read. And the Illinois, there was a referendum on whether to empower the legislature to ban all blacks from Illinois, which passed with 75% of the vote. So there was rules about whether free blacks having to post expensive bonds to come into the state. Truthfully, culturally, legally, politically, this is for all intents and purposes a slave state or a southern state when Lincoln is coming into politics. And yet for all this, Lincoln is one of two members of the legislature who remonstrate against a resolution there that was there approving of slavery. And I just told you about his constituents and some of the things that they supported. But while he was a member of Congress, he took that most radical position, that fourth position, the Wilmot Proviso position, every opportunity it was offered to him, essentially as a member of Congress. And so I believe that could only proceed from a genuine conviction of the heart. And I'm not saying he had a modern view of racial equality, but slavery was something from his earliest days that he always really just felt inherently was wrong.
You want to speak to this as well?
Yeah, look, this is not me. Just read Eric Foner's book, The Fiery Trial, and that's all you need to know about Lincoln and slavery. But, I try to deal with that a little bit in my book. And, what's the point of departure? Is it Lincoln as the racist, or Lincoln as, having a secret plan to get rid of slavery? The thing is, I think Foner is right here, and I try to, deal with that a little bit here. Lincoln changes. At the beginning of the war, you can make the argument that his thinking on race is pretty limited, certainly by our standards, but even by the 19th century. How much he really supports colonization, if he really does support it, whether he did, he did speak in support of it. I think, if I can put it in a nutshell, Lincoln at the beginning of the war doesn't really think of African Americans as of American society. They are in American society, but they are not really legitimately Americans. By the end of the war, that's gone.
Yeah.
He has rethought that, and now black people are not only in but of American society. An American democracy is going to have to be reconstructed on a whole new way of thinking. It's not whiteness and citizenship. That's not what it's all about anymore. So he changes. And that's what's so great about studying Lincoln. It's not this Lincoln who's, marble man who doesn't change. He did grow. He did change in response to circumstances.
Well, as Billy Herndon, his law partner, said, he fought more than any other man he ever knew. And I think that was certainly part of it. And he had a mind to be able to do that and coalesce around a germ of an idea and bind it, as he said, north and south and east and west, so he could then reiterate it to others so they would understand it as well. We're getting close to the end here. I want to put you both to work for a moment to sign some books while I do a little bit of business here. So there are some here just to sign for us, please. I think you have pens here. Here we are. And I'm going to just thank a few of you who have ordered books and have supported us and then supported the publishers bringing authors such as this and good experiences such as this here to the shop. Richard in Winnetka, Paul in Springfield, Ohio, James in Lawrence, Kansas, Todd in Des Moines, Iowa, Douglas in Louisville, Kentucky, Kent in Oklahoma City, Tony in Gettysburg, PA, Harold in Pottsville, Pennsylvania, Garrett in Lancaster, California, the Lincoln Library at Lawrence University in Appleton, Sylvia, who works here, her son is there, Michael in Aledo, Illinois, Dan, nice to that you're here with us in Beaver Dam, Wisconsin. Tom in Fairview, Oregon. Tim in Salem, Oregon. James in Lawrence, Kansas. Stephen in Fayetteville, Pennsylvania. Christopher in Fair Lawn, Ohio. James in Pleasant Mountain, Pennsylvania. Terry in West Chicago, Illinois. James in Brown Deer, Wisconsin. We have others, but I want to keep going here a little bit. I want to give a reminder that, first of all, today, July 18th, is the 150th anniversary of the assault on Battery Wagner near Charleston by the 54th Massachusetts. So either watch Glory tonight, or if you want, you can buy a Brave Black Regiment by Emilio that will also talk about that assault. So if you'd like to do that, I think this is $15.95 if you want this particular copy. Upcoming shows, Saturday, August 17th, Fred Reed with Abraham Lincoln, Beyond the American Icon. He's been here before with his first volume in this, and is replete with artifacts and interesting material from the Lincoln world. And then we're also in talks to get Jonathan Hennessy with his very popular and fascinating book, The Gettysburg Address, a graphic adaptation. We'll see if we can get that for you. And now in November, look for Doris Kearns Goodwin to be here with her The Bully Pulpit, which of course is on Teddy Roosevelt, Taft, and the Muckrakers, and that's going to be a lot of fun. I want to get to a couple of things, and maybe we'll go a few moments beyond as well, because Joshua Giddings, I mean, we can't go too far without talking about him. What a fascinating person that was. Ann Spriggs's boarding house is where Lincoln, Mary, the kids were for a while. Finally, he gratefully sent them home and then wished he hadn't, but that's a different story. He learned. So this was called Abolitionist House, for heaven's sakes. How come that didn't smear him from then on, and he could actually get onto the presidency without being smeared as just like Wendell Phillips or Garrison, a pure abolitionist?
Well, you know, one of the reasons was because of the D.C. Emancipation Bill that he introduced. It was still something that had a tough fugitive slave component to it. You know, this was someone who had still clearly, you know, in his rhetoric and in his policies had been a moderate on the issue.
Well, he wanted to get this bill through.
Yes.
And he needed that to do that. Yeah.
Yes, and so he was never held in the same sort of suspicion as some of his, you know, when you look at the correspondence that precedes the Republican Convention in 1860, and people talk about, well, Bates as potentially being, you know, too conservative on this issue and Seward being too radical on this issue. You know, Lincoln was someone who people didn't know a whole lot about and someone that they could sort of project whatever they thought their beliefs onto. Sort of like he did with Zachary Taylor, like they all did with Zachary Taylor, sort of a cipher. And so, you know, just, I guess living in the house was one thing. You know, they called it Abolition House because Giddings lived there. Prior to Lincoln's time there'd been another famous abolitionist who lived there. And it was, you could talk about abolition at the dinner table, you know, 10 years before it was polite to do anywhere else in Washington, D.C. or around the country. And you know what's so fascinating is, and this is a very little known story, I learned it from researching this book, one of the servants there, who was a black, who was earning his freedom, was actually kidnapped and sold into slavery in the South. So somebody that waited on Lincoln, waited on his family, every day for the first couple months that he was there, got kidnapped at gunpoint in front of his wife and sold into the South in slavery. So slavery was a very, very real thing in Washington, D.C. in Lincoln's 30th Congress.
That's slave territory.
Yeah.
What influence did Giddings have, do you think, on Lincoln's thought, since they were right there at the dinner table?
Yeah, you know,
day in, day out.
One of Lincoln's colleagues who served with him in the Illinois legislature and in Congress said Giddings was the linchpin. His time with Giddings, talking to Giddings about this issue, really forced him to think these things through and to think, you know, something really ought to be done about this. You know, another interesting story is when he's on the campaign trail for Taylor, he meets Seward for the first time, and they're speaking at Tremont Temple in Boston, and Seward goes first, and Seward gives a very fiery speech about slavery. And if you believe Seward's telling of it, subsequent to that, they met in Seward's hotel room, and Lincoln said, you know what, I listened to what you said, and I think it is time to start doing more than giving lip service to this issue. That being against slavery meant maybe something more than just believing that in your heart.
Well, what part did Frederick Douglass have at this? I mean, did he put a nail in that coffin that allowed him to understand what the black experience is in America, and that they themselves felt themselves as Americans?
Well, you know, again, the short answer to that is Jim Oakes' book, The Radical and the Republican, on Lincoln and Frederick Douglass. You know, they didn't really, they only met 3 times. It's not like they were friends or anything like that. But Oakes shows in that book how they converge. You know, Lincoln becomes more radical, as it were, and Douglas becomes more, not conservative, but more pragmatic about how to achieve idealistic goals within the real world. Now, was Lincoln an abolitionist? He said he wasn't. He always said he's not an abolitionist, and in the North he's not an abolitionist. But you ask the Southerners in 1860 if Lincoln is an abolitionist, right? And so it's not that it's about semantics, but you know, Lincoln he is transformed by his experience in Washington, and yet he's kind of at the conservative end of northern anti-slavery politics. Is that because he has a master plan to get power and then do something good once you have, obviously not. But
People
it
have
is
said
an
that.
interesting. Can I ask Chris one question along these same lines?
Yes, please.
How many times did Lincoln vote for the Wilmot Proviso in Congress?
Okay, so he
Because
talks
he
about,
said, I voted for like 50 times or something, whatever it was after. How many times did he actually vote for it?
it's at least that many if you count the following. So first of all, you get what's the Wilmot Proviso, right? Well, it's no slavery in the territory ceded by Mexico. But if you think, what's the principle of the Wilmot
Right.
Proviso? It's no expansion of
No.
slavery. So you include every vote that he gives on incorporating Oregon as a state. Because
Oh, okay,
Oregon gets
yeah.
incorporated with Wilmot Proviso language.
Right.
So think about that, like all the principles of the Wilmot Proviso, the idea that slavery won't expand. And then the fact that there were a lot of procedural votes. So, and one of the things you would always do is because, people were hanging out in the House bar and the Senate bar. If you look at the vote totals in the 30th Congress, they're always they're never representing anywhere close to the whole number of members. So if you want to vote on the floor, the first thing you would do would be to change your vote to no, ask for reconsideration, and then have it finalized. Because otherwise someone could come back from the bar, now they've got the numbers, they ask for reconsideration, now you're on the losing end. So there would be votes, to bring it to the floor, there would be votes for reconsideration,
yes, right.
and so there would be a number of procedural votes, but it's at least that many times. I went through and I tried to count them all. And I said, if you take the spirit of the Wilmot Proviso, that's really an accurate statement. It's not an exaggeration as it's been treated.